So I would like to begin and give the floor to Monique. She is super gracious and let us use Art Love Collective today to host this event. So,
Hi everybody, my name is Monique Mercurio. I am the Director of Operations here for Art Love Collective. We've been here for 1.5 years, and what sets us apart from any other space or gallery in town is that we put inclusivity and accessibility as the forefront in our mission. We have a bunch of different workshops. We have, everybody in here is a local artist, a couple from Topeka, one from Kansas City. But we also, the space is available to rent out for private parties. If you want to do a party with your friends and you want to have a karaoke party, but you want to also have a paint and sip, or you want to have, a yoga event with some mindfulness. I have a artist in here who does aromatherapy. Like, I have so many good artists in here that have so many good things to bring to community that we can do in this space together. So if you have any events, if you have any corporate events, if you want to do any parties, we've done all kinds of things in here. We have caterers on standby. So please think of us next time you guys want to host an event. Also follow us on the socials. We have a lot of free workshops that we offer to the community because we believe that art is mental health support, and that's not always accessible by everybody. So we want to be sure to take up space in that capacity by offering ways for people to feel good and have a way to work through things. So please follow us, please come, please join us in community, and thank you for being here.
and I would just like to thank the Art Love Collective again for letting us use this space today. The work they do is truly incredible. It doesn't take much to recognize that. You can just look around and look at all these incredible pieces of work that people have put together. So, I want to start off by introducing myself today. My name is Natasha Torkzaban, and I am 18 years old and the daughter of Garnush Farshadfar and Siamak Torkzaban, two deaf Iranian immigrants. I'm the current editor-in-chief of The Budget, the student newspaper at Lawrence High School, and I plan on attending Northwestern University in the fall to double major in journalism and legal studies. My journey with advocacy with the underrepresented community began when I was 4 years old, translating for my parents at doctor's appointments and arguing with TSA at the airport. At a young age, I realized that for my family, representation wasn't always available. As I got older, using writing to represent my family and others like me became my passion, and journalism became the guiding hand. That is why I decided to organize this event today, to discuss the importance of having people with diverse backgrounds and experiences in the newsroom. My story and the experiences I've gained from it allow me to provide a diverse perspective to classrooms and communities where many times I found myself relating to and supporting people who may feel alone in their story. Your stories and the experiences you've gained from it allow you to make you invaluable, giving you a perspective that you can't learn from a journalism school or writing workshop. I invite you all here today to help empower journalists of color and educate allies on how to be conscious of stories they might not relate to. And I would like to go through and introduce everyone that is here with us today. First off is Maya Hodison. Since October 2022, Maya Hodison, age 24, has been an equity reporter and engagement director of the Lawrence Times, a grassroots publication founded in February 2021 by the powerhouse Mackenzie Clark. Prior to her full-time role, she interned and worked part-time with the Times. Maya feels connected to social justice through writing and journalism and believes in free access to community news. She graduated from Baker University in May 2022 with a degree in mass media and a sociology minor. Having been born and raised in Lawrence, Maya now has the opportunity to examine her hometown through a different lens, both coming to appreciate the community so much more while being able to critique it deeper. She's covered topics relating to Black history, public school budget issues, and elementary school closures, the art scene in Lawrence, court reporting, and more. In this year's Kansas Press Association competition, one of her articles won second place for Best News Story of the Year. Last year, she wrote part of an abortion story series that won a third place award, and her equity coverage contributed to the Times' Best Coverage of Diversity honor. I would like to give a round of applause to Maya Hodison. Next up, we have Marae Rose Williams. Marae Rose Williams is a native of Long Island, New York, and graduated from Ohio University with a bachelor's degree in news writing and editing. A year ago, she was promoted to assistant managing editor for race and equity at the Kansas City Star, where she has worked as a news reporter, columnist, and editorial page writer for the past 27 years. Among her awards and honors, she was a recipient for the Alfred Friendly Foundation Fellowship, won the NABJ Excellence in Writing Award, and the Gerald Loeb Award. In 2020, Murray conceived and wrote, along with 3 other reporters, the multi-award-winning Truth in Black and White, a 6-story project in which the Star apologized for decades of failing to fully cover Kansas City's Black communities. Round of applause for Murray. And then we have Patricia Gaston. Patricia E. Gaston joined the University of Kansas as the Lacey C. Haynes Professor in 2018 after a long, stellar career at the Washington Post, where she was an editor who worked on several desks, including national, foreign, and editorial. Before coming to the Post in 1997, Gaston worked at the Dallas Morning News, where she was an assistant foreign editor and was co-editor of the 1994 Pulitzer Prize-winning series on violence against women. Gaston grew up in Kansas City, Kansas, and graduated from the University of Kansas in 1981. She has a master's degree in sports management from the George Washington University. Next, we have Melissa Greene-Blye. Melissa Greene-Blye, of the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma, worked as an anchor and reporter for 20 years in the news, business, and television markets, big and small. She is now an assistant professor at the University of Kansas William Allen White School of Journalism and Mass Communications. Her research expertise centers on Native representation in news media past and present, with the goal of improving coverage and representation of indigenous identity issues and individuals in the current movement. Melissa also enjoys using her knowledge and experience to educate the newest generation of journalists. She is the co-director of the KU Native Storytelling Workshop, a summer program that seeks to introduce indigenous high school students to the skills needed to pursue a major or career in journalism and media. She is also the faculty supervisor for Good Morning Indian Country, a weekly live streaming Native student-led news and information program. And lastly, we have Ryan Sorrell. Ryan has a diverse background, including working at one of the nation's top esteemed Black think tanks, one of Chicago's top tech PR agencies, a top 3 global PR firm, and founded one of Kansas City's largest Black-led abolitionist direct action movements during the 2020 uprisings. He was a key organizer in the October 2021 21-day occupation on the grounds of Kansas City's City Hall following the horrific brutalization of a 9-month pregnant Black woman by a KCPD officer. And formerly, he was temporarily suspended from his college at Loyola University of Chicago for organizing the largest social justice demonstration in university history, before being pardoned by the president in the university's first ever pardon resulting from the national outcry about the situation. During Ryan's professional career, he consulted brands such as Facebook, Samsung, Amazon, and Google. He's a recipient of the Civil and Human Rights Award recognized by the Urban League of Kansas City, Innovator of the Year by the Local Media Association, and Emerging Leader of the Year from the Institute for Nonprofit News. Most recently, he founded the nation's fastest growing Black nonprofit digital news startup and community organization, the Kansas City Defender. So for those of you who don't know, I am going to go through and read a series of questions, and any of our panelists are free to pick up the mic and answer the questions, and we will hopefully have time at the end to provide an open Q&A session. So, my first question is, perspective and connection isn't just about what's taught in journalism school. It's also shaped by lived experiences. Can you share any experiences where your identity as a person of color has shaped the way you've covered a story or approached an interview?
I'll start. So I grew up here in Lawrence, a white community. My childhood home is on the northwest side of town, so I attended the schools that, if there were to say there was some diversity, it wasn't going to be those schools. So I had a lot of, identity crises at different moments in my life, but I always had, my family as a backbone, and I had my church family as a backbone too. So I would travel to Topeka to attend a Black church, and I would sit and listen to my grandfather who had quite a few years in the civil rights movement, and he had a lot of stories to share with me. So I kind of had to learn that, you know, my lived experiences were enough, and that I was gaining the valuable experience that was needed to be able to speak on my community. Kamar J. Shaw was 14 years old when he was murdered here in Lawrence, Kansas. And when he died, I had no idea that I was going to be the one to see the trial for his murder through. I wanted to do a story that really spoke to who Kamar J. was as a person and didn't continue to perpetuate what we saw with other local papers criminalizing this young black kid. And so when I was connecting with his family, I wanted to be intentional about making sure I wasn't there to exploit, making sure that they understood that I understood them, and I felt that there was a sense of comfort from them. It's kind of like walking into a room and you see another black person and you give the head nod. It's kind of like that. It's just a sense of comfort. So I think it was there off the bat, and I knew I had to work in order to build that relationship. But I think my experiences, my knowledge, and my passion for uplifting black people allowed me to tell that story about who he was and not what happened to him.
I think that, so I've been black all my life, if you have noticed, and so everything I do and everywhere I go, I bring my lived experience into that situation. So not just covering, you know, an issue that might be of great interest to black and brown people, but when I go into a situation where I'm the only black person in the room and everybody's white and I still have to communicate with them to get the story, I still bring my lived experiences to that and my blackness to that, and managing my blackness so that I can get the information that I need. So it is an everyday, every moment, every situation kind of thing. I never leave it behind. I can't just take it off and hang it in the closet and say, oh, today I don't need it. No, every day it is with me. But I just wanted to give you like two little examples of how my lived experiences has impacts my work. So several years ago, the Kansas City Star was doing a project called for human trafficking. And they spent a lot of time and a lot of money on this project. And I was not involved with it. But one day I was walking past the desk of one of the reporters who was involved, and they had the printout sheet of what it was going to look like. And the headline across that project said, "The New Slavery." And I was like, now here's where my lived experience kicked in. I went, wait, the new slavery? There is only one. There can't be another one. You can't say the new slavery. That just made my skin crawl. So I picked it up and I walked into the managing editor's office and I said, we can't say that. I mean, the new slavery, it basically sounds as if now slavery, we're not thinking about that anymore. It's gone. We can't just say the new slavery. He goes, well, this project is done. What would you suppose we do? I said, how about we just change it to a new slavery? He said, one word? I said, yeah. A new slavery means also another, not the. So that little thing was how no one else would have noticed that, would have felt that. But I felt it and made the change. And that's how your lived experiences and who you are and how you see things can be so different. Something that simple. Oh, I didn't know you had it.
So I want to piggyback off what Murray said. When you're an editor in the room, it makes a huge difference. Sometimes you're not going to get those, you're not going to win every day. But when you become in charge, it changes the way the newsroom functions. And I like to believe that me just being in the room and being at the big table with the boys made a difference in a lot of things. I will say that one of the other things that I think about when you're in the newsroom is that there are a lot of assumptions that are made about us. When you walk in, unless you've sat down and had a conversation with me, you may be thinking, well, where did she grow up? What was her life like? Et cetera, et cetera. And I'll never forget, there was a discussion in the Post newsroom. I was on the national desk then, and we were just having a discussion about, it was a coverage issue. And somebody was making the point about, where people lived and where they grew up. And it was funny because I looked around at the other 3 black people sitting at the desk with me and sitting at the table. All of us had grown up middle class, and in fact, upper middle class. We had no idea about some stuff that was happening in some bad neighborhoods. And so I was like, well, wait a minute. Where do you all think, why do you think we would know about that? Have you taken a moment to get to know who we are? We are more than just, our cover and the stereotypes. And so that is one of those things that it doesn't happen all the time, but when it does, you have to be ready to jump on it. And that particular day, I was like, wait a minute. You can't make assumptions about me. You don't have any idea who I am. And you've not taken the time to get to know me and to know all of the things that come with Pat, not just the fact that she is brown. So representation does matter each and every day. And like I said, some days you're gonna win, many days you're gonna lose. But I tell you what, when you go in, when it's time for you to go in and make that point, you can make the point.
And I think an example I can offer is something that one of the reasons representation in newsrooms, in news spaces at all levels is so important is the ability to provide important context that will often be lacking in coverage or missing because nobody in the room understands that context. For example, for me, is years ago as a reporter, I was assigned to cover the opening of a tribal casino. Well, the newsroom that I was coming from was couching this in sort of a morality fight. The local community didn't want gambling, churches were coming out against this, lawmakers were concerned, the whole issue of whether gambling should be allowed in the state, et cetera, et cetera. Nobody understood the context from the tribal perspective of how this issue was a sovereignty issue, an economic issue, et cetera. And so something I was able to bring into those conversations in our morning meeting was, you all are covering this in the news value of conflict, but who then is telling the story of this nation and why this matters to them beyond the fact that they're on the other side of wanting to be able to do this. And being able to bring in some bigger picture historical context so that all sides and voices are represented and it doesn't just become this us versus them dynamic, right? We teach that conflict is a news value, but we sometimes fail to define that conflict accurately or fully.
Yes, I'll definitely agree with everything that's already been said, and I think for myself, I think as my bio mentioned, I didn't go to journalism school and I never worked in a formal newsroom, never had any actual traditional journalistic experience prior to launching The Defender, and for me that, I've always viewed that as a positive thing, and I have always also approached, really I came into journalism not because it was something I wanted to do, I came into it because I was very frustrated and outraged, I would say, with how journalism has been practiced really since the beginning of the United States and since the very first news outlets in United States history. And so rather than pointing to one story, which I definitely could, I would more so say, I look at it from like, how has my experience as a Black person shaped my philosophy and values and understanding of what media should be and how it should function and the purpose that it should serve specifically for the Black community. And so the very first thing I did when I was coming into journalism, when I started The Defender, was look at the very first news outlet in the United States because I wanted to understand where do these ideals and values, things like objectivity that we're supposed to adhere to, or at least that we're often taught we're supposed to adhere to as journalists or people in media. And so I look back at the very first news outlet in American history, which was the Boston Newsletter. And within the very first month of their existence, they were already reliant on slave ads to function and as the primary revenue stream for their business model. And so from the very beginning of American history, that is what journalism, professionalized journalism at least, was rooted in. And so for me, whenever I just always am very critical of professionalized journalism, and I even hesitate to call myself a journalist. I prefer things like media organizer or media worker as opposed to a journalist. But yeah, I think for us as an outlet, we're constantly thinking about what are the pieces of formal journalism that we do appreciate, things like having multiple sources. I think there are technical skills that can be very important to conveying accurate, truthful information with integrity as a newsroom, but we're also just generally wanting to interrogate the things that journalism supposedly that are in like the journalistic canon. And so the very last thing I'll say is, for a quick example, is really just anytime the police tell us something as a news outlet, like oftentimes the police will send these so-called official police reports, and me as a black person, having personally had a gun pulled on me by a police officer before, as a black person who has seen what the police do to people in our communities, that has made me very suspicious of the police. And so that also shapes how we do our journalism in our newsroom, the language that we use, and generally just how we approach what we think the purpose of media should be for our community.
So I would like to touch on this question a little bit too, if that's all right. When I was rereading this question, I thought of the most recent thing that had happened. I thought of the most recent project that we had covered, and that's definitely Gavel. Hi Morgan, hi Jack. They're my counterparts that helped, work with us. And then there's my advisor right there. She helped with that too. And for those of you who don't know, that was essentially a surveillance software that our school district had implemented on our computers in the voice of trying to say that it was suicide prevention and stuff, and we necessarily didn't agree with that. It was violating our notes, scanning our work, the whole shebang. So we felt like that wasn't fair, and we felt like that wasn't right. But there was many people around us that asked, why does that matter? Why does it matter that you guys can't? Why does it matter that you should be afraid of posting one story? Why does it matter that this little thing happened? And I think for me, that felt much more personal because my family's Middle Eastern. I've been raised here, and so censorship is something that feels much closer to me. Sorry, guys.
It's okay.
This is my secret stash.
Thank you.
I got one.
And so my perspective on that was, I know what that looks like on a large scale, and I know what that feels like on a large scale. So to hear that I was being faced with that at the local level, which more minute, made me feel much more for my family in the Middle East, and it almost triggered me in a way to think about holy crap, why doesn't anyone care about this? Because if this is exacerbated on a much larger scale, that is what it looks like. And so that was a little bit of my thoughts in that moment, and I truly don't believe I would have thought of that at all unless I had those lived experiences as a Middle Eastern woman, knowing that my family has faced that for so many years. So, my next question is, Can you speak to any instances where the absence of diverse voices in a newsroom has led to blind spots or gaps in coverage? I know we touched on that a little bit, but.
Yeah. Okay, so in 2020, the Kansas City Star, the project that Natasha mentioned earlier that I worked on, The Truth in Black and White, was all about that. So this was during the protest, Black Lives Matter's protest after the killing of George Floyd. I had gone out to cover one of those protests. A lot happened. But what did happen was nothing that was not what police had said had been happening, okay? The reports prior to that were all about how the protesters were violent and out of control and had to be sprayed with repellent. When I got out there, none of that was happening. It was the other way around. It was the intimidation from the police. And so we wrote about that. But in the process of covering that story, I was sprayed with repellent. And so I was furious about all of that. And I started thinking about, what was happening and what I was really seeing. And what I was seeing was Kansas City ready to tussle with race. That's what I saw at that moment, because there were people of all races and ages. And I also started thinking about what has the Kansas City Star's perspective been with race? What is their history? And so I started doing some research, and I found out not just the Kansas City Star, but newspapers across the country, mainstream newspapers across the country, had failed to present the truth about who Black America is. And they had done it strategically, repeatedly. Anytime they wrote about Black America, they were going to the officials and allowing them to tell them who Black America is. Never did they go to Black America and talk to Black America and talk to the people in their community. So we were hearing about who people were based on what officials who didn't know them and didn't live with them, thought. And so here's my pitch at the time. Like I said to them was, if you don't go to school with Black folks, which folks didn't, if you don't work with Black folks, which folks didn't, if you don't live near Black folks, which folks didn't, you don't go to school with them, you don't live near them, the only thing you know about who Black America is what you read in your mainstream newspaper. And if they're lying to you and telling you that they're criminals or perpetrators of crime, that they're poorly educated, that they live in squalor, all of these things that were consistently year after year after year for decade after decade after decade being told to the general public about who Black America is, they were perpetuating racism, and they were guilty for that and needed to apologize for that. So, Ryan is right, and I get what Ryan does. I love what Ryan does, because for so many years, the lack of being engaged with your communities and talking to your communities and giving them and getting to know, as Patricia said, who these people are, led to so much failure about how we cover Black and brown people, and mainstream media has been guilty. I love the work I do, but because I love it, I want to call it out.
I can, pick up a little bit on that, and I might have lost a little bit of the thread of the original question, but I think it is a little bit about what Ryan was talking about, which is a need to interrogate the practice of news gathering, the process of news. It is a deadline-driven industry, so there are deadlines, they are real, but what if we were to stop and say, is this a story that has to happen today, or is it a story we want to happen today? And so when I talk about that, it is because, especially with indigenous communities where we see failures and sometimes this lack of coverage, is because it's not always easy to get those stories. There are centuries of mistrust built up. Our stories have been co-opted, our stories have been told for us. We have been talked about and around, but not always in conversation with. And so maybe we've heard of parachute journalism. a big story happens, boop, journalists from across the country jump into a community. And they want that story now, and they expect you to talk to them and tell them the story in the way that they are perceiving the story. But what you'll hear all the time in indigenous communities is like, we don't know who you are. We don't owe you anything. If you want to start covering us, come to a basketball game. You know, start building relationships. And unfortunately, news, as it has historically and traditionally been practiced, doesn't leave a lot of room for relationship building. And so I think we are at a point where gone are the days where you as a journalist can walk into a community and expect and or demand and extract stories and information. Because unfortunately, so often when we go into those communities, it is at a moment where that community is hurting. And we want to take that hurt. And we haven't spent time covering any other aspect of things happening. So making time to build relationships would go far in correcting some of this.
That's what I do now. I mean, my whole job as a result of that series was to become assistant managing editor for race and equity, and my job is to build first a bridge of engagement, and then secondly a bridge of trust, and I'm the bridge. So I spend all of my days, in the community, talking to people, meeting people, going to events, hanging out with them, going to coffees, talking to people, getting to know them, telling them what we do at the Star, and then bringing some of their ideas and stories back to the people at the Star, talking to them about the people I met in the community and how the story needs to look, and so I'm the bridge between the Star and the community, because if without it, you can't just parachute in, extract from a community, and give nothing back.
And yet, unfortunately, it still
happens. Oh yeah, it still happens. But I do think that newspapers are beginning to realize that they can no longer do that, thanks to a lot of young people. I think young people are intolerant of intolerance, and so they just are like, we're not having it, and you're going to get that pushback because they are completely intolerant of intolerance. Sorry. No. This is my stuff. I love it. I can talk about this forever.
No, I really like everything you all have said so far, because sitting here thinking about it, it really is a form of dehumanization to try and start, infiltrating a community and trying to impose yourself upon a community without building relationships first and asking them what they need and what's missing. And I think that's a lot of what we're trying to do here in Lawrence with the Times. Something that really resonated with me when you were talking about the Black community in Kansas City was our community here experiencing homelessness. It's been a huge issue here. I haven't worked on a lot of the coverage myself, but my colleagues have, and we found that a lot of the narratives around our folks experiencing homelessness here have been written for them. A lot of hateful rhetoric spread about them, and a lot of mistrust has come from that. They can't trust media to tell their stories, to tell their truths, and so we have to take our time to build relationships with them and make sure that it's okay that we're entering their spaces and that we're doing it correctly.
I'll say a conversation I recently had with several student journalists was in a space where something had happened, and we so often hear in news copy, and I speak from a broadcast perspective, something bad happens and the story always ends with our hearts go out to the community, our hearts go out to, and I took some copy and I said, I'm going to revise this, and here's why. You don't get to say that, because it wasn't the Lawrence community, it was the Lawrence indigenous community. And they don't want your heart going out because you haven't been there in the past. And so in that moment, it sounds like a platitude, and it sounds like performative. And that has happened for so long in so many contexts. So if we can mindfully educate the next generation of journalists and the current generation of journalists to be mindful in those moments, that audience is highly aware when those sorts of things are put there as a placeholder, even though the journalists who wrote this did it with the best of intention. I said, I want you to learn this now so that you don't go out in the world when social media can respond to you doing it. So,
Can I just be random?
Of course.
Absolute question statement. When you are holding people accountable in that way and kind of letting them know like why that doesn't feel good to hear, how are they taking that, and how do you handle it if they become defensive?
It's an amazing question.
Well, you have to have conversations. Again, that's what communication is. I tell my students, you can't be a communicator if you're not going to talk, if we're not going to have any kind of dialogue, if we're not going to, have an open mind about things. And you got to have those conversations. And all the reporters I've worked with, we didn't always have great conversations. But some of them, you just go ahead and say, you know what, we can do better with this next time. We've got to do this time. And let's figure out why you're feeling that way. And then maybe let's talk about why the group would feel the way they do. And sometimes we have to put ourselves into those spaces. It isn't for very long, but at least I think you have to be empathetic and you have to be sympathetic to some things. That doesn't mean that you can't still do your job. But what that means is, I think it changes the way you look at other people and their plights and what is happening. And then you're more open to want to find out, well, why is it like that? One of the things that happens in newsrooms and that I'm seeing even on campus now is there's a lack of curiosity. We don't care, look to the right, look to the left, front and back. I tell my students all the time, because what is happening here? What's happening there? And usually these stories are not that far away. They are always right in front of you. But if you're not curious and interested, then I'm not going to be able to go and have a conversation with the source or a potential source from another group and be open to what it is they have to say. So a lot of it has to come from that curiosity factor. And when we lose that, then we're in a bad place and space.
Yeah, and to just add to that a little bit, I think something that is something that has been super hard for me to grasp, honestly, has been having those super developed conversations with people that I might strongly disagree with. And I think that I've had to learn the line between when a conversation is helpful and when a conversation is actually helping me understand, because I'm a curious person. I'm always asking questions. Everyone around me knows that, and frankly, they get pissed off by it. But that's something I take a lot of pride in. But I think that I've also learned that there's a time where it's okay for me to step away if I feel like the conversation isn't going somewhere that is helpful to either of us. But I feel like it's really important for us to really take the time and truly listen to people and understand why. I also think it's important to not excuse people's behavior because we know the reason why. So I think that's been something that's been hard for me to grasp, but it's been very helpful.
And I would say to what was just asked, one of the things I stated during that same conversation was, I can look at this article, I can look at this copy, and everything about it is done perfectly from a journalism with a capital J perspective. The headline is spot on, succinct to the point, the article is all factual and correct, but it's lacking some context. So you can choose to be a journalist or a news outlet in a community and do perfect journalism, But if you are tone deaf to part of the community in which you are functioning as a journalist or as a news outlet, I'm not sure what you're winning. And I certainly hope not journalism awards. But you absolutely can practice journalism to perfection and be utterly tone deaf to the people who are part of that community. And I would say the community that you're serving. And I think part of where we are is interrogating what it means to be a journalist, to do journalism. And I think those definitions have changed in very good ways, and I think will continue to change. I think one of the funniest and scariest moments we had recently was a recruiter with a major media company came to campus, and he told my students, he's like, every new generation redefines journalism.
Yeah.
And I said, could you say that a little louder? But that's a scary thing for us because we have known how to do journalism in certain ways for so long. So being willing to interrogate ourselves and our practice is crucial to making progress.
You certainly should never write about, a journalist should never write about a community without allowing that community's voice in the story. I mean, that's one of the things that like young journalists will like at the start. We have a lot of young journalists, and they might want to do a one-person story and a one-source story. And I'm like, well, is this person part of the community you're talking about? No, but they are familiar. No, you cannot write a story about any particular community without allowing that community voice to be present, and in a great way. And even if it's somebody that you disagree with as a journalist, when they're making a point and you strongly disagree with them, you still have an obligation as a journalist to allow that voice to be heard. Now, you let the voice be heard, but then there can always be a counter voice. And if they're saying something that isn't true, allow them to say the truth is, and then document in it, almost like, I mean, it's getting to be words, like you're vetting everything someone says, but if you know that that thing is not true, then you write the truth below it and say where you got that information from, almost like you're preparing a debate or something of that nature. But even if you disagree with a voice, that's what makes journalism really special, because no one's going to have respect for the journalist who only puts one side of this information in there. Even if you don't agree with the information, you have an obligation to give them voice. I can't ask for my voice if I'm not going to give you yours.
Yeah, and I'm really glad we talked about that because I know as a Middle Eastern person, I don't even need to dive into too much of this, but we know why people are in the news all the time, and we know that it's frequently twisted up and upsetting to see. So, on that same note about communities and making sure that we're listening to everyone, it is no lie that 70% of journalists are white, and as people of color, as journalists of color, their responsibility can't always be on us to amplify the voices of these minority communities. So how can editors be good allies, and how can people make sure they're listening to you in those situations, even if they aren't a person of color?
Part of that is doing some self-education, I think, and being supportive of newsroom education. I am constantly amazed at when I'm in groups, whether it's with students or in professional or scholarly gatherings, people aren't aware of the resources available through the Indigenous Journalists Association, which was formerly the Native American Journalists Association. I mean, a simple trip to their website under the resources tab yields invaluable education, information, talking points, and examples for how to do things better. And I think it's fair to say constantly, frequently, often, regularly has workshops on covering topics in Indian country, challenges of Native journalists, and it's always the same people, and we all know one another, that are in the webinars. I don't ever see any large legacy media, national or local, joining in the conversation. So that's one way to do that, is seeking out educational opportunities and resources for those in your newsroom.
I definitely would agree for sure, and I think one of the things that I think about, which a lot of the people in our newsroom are high schools. Like, we have quite a few high school students on our actual staff who help make big decisions about our organization, who write pieces, who are actual leaders just as much as anybody else in our organization. And the reason that I think that that's important is because I'm also rereading this book by Dr. Carter G. Woodson called The Miseducation of the Negro. And the reason I think that book is important is because in that book he talks about how he's not concerned with Black people who are uneducated. He's concerned about Black people who have been educated at the highest levels and who might have gone to quote unquote elite universities and schools. And the reason I mention that is because I think it's very difficult to get someone who is an adult to unlearn all of the years of essentially indoctrination that they received through formal schooling, even through journalistic programs as well. And so I would say that the long-term solution, I think that there are short-term solutions in terms of helping people get access to, say, transjournalist resources, indigenous resources, Black resources. I think all of those are very important in the short term, but in the long term, I think we do have to be thinking about systems change, basically, and actually putting people of color in these positions so that we don't have to rely, basically, on non-people of color to go out of their way for years and years to learn how to not be problematic and violent in the reporting that they're doing. So I would just say I think that we can't have short-term solutions, but I think equally important is actually trying to transform these institutions to where we have people of color in them, so we don't have to be reliant on allies to speak on our behalf, basically.
And kind of broadening up that angle, what do you think news organizations should take to foster a more inclusive and equitable environment for journalists of color, both in terms of hiring practices and editorial decision making?
Let's just talk real. I was in the newsroom for nearly 40 years. I was at Gannett, Rochester, New York, where we were the first newspaper to start diversity training and looking at putting more diverse sources and stories. So that was in 1981, y'all. And I've been to 2 other big newsrooms. And it's cyclical. My friends at the Washington Post now, they're it's cyclical. It goes up and down. It depends on who's out there, who's available, who's going to come into these newsrooms. There is no one size fits all. It has to come down to whether or not people are intentional about what they want to do. And that's in anything. That's whether or not it's in academia, that's in media, it's the intentionality of the people who are in charge. And I hear you, Ryan. Yeah, there's some old folks that probably can't learn some new things, but there's a lot of us who have had to learn new things. And I don't know how you can be in journalism and not keep reinventing and changing and doing all kinds of things. The business is not static. None of this is static. Everything is new. My prof colleagues would tell you that, it's changing minute by minute. So we're having to be up on those things. But in terms of trying to get people of color into some of these places and spaces, we just are gonna have to still keep it's a day in, day out thing. And you can't make generalities about any of this. because some people, when I was hiring and whatnot, some people were like, well, there's nobody out there. Well, no, there are people out there. You just have not looked at the list of folks that I've given you. Or, this one is sitting right in the room and should be moved up. Okay? So there's a lot of that. And so anyway, that's one of those pieces that gets me all the time, even now still. And you know, counseling young journalists, you know, again, I just think you get in there, you figure out what's what. I've had a lot of mentees over the years who have left because it just wasn't for them anymore. And you know what, and that's okay. That really is okay. Go find something else to do that really works for you, that in which you can still use a lot of those skills. But it really is a shame that at our legacy papers, at our websites, et cetera, that we're just not seeing people of color in some of those jobs. And you know what? They should be able to do those jobs because I've worked with a ton of them. And they were more than capable of taking care of things. It's okay for us to work on the weekends. Why can't we work during the week and do those jobs? Okay, and be in control, be in charge. So it's something that hopefully, you know, again, it's cyclical. Hopefully things will change. You know, I just don't know. It's hard to know.
Well, and if I can say, I think a huge part of that would be committing resources.
Yep.
You know, we've come a long way, I think maybe since some of us came up in the industry where internships weren't necessarily paid. I think increasingly more, it's harder to find an internship that is not paid.
Right.
But if some of these larger ownership media companies would commit and invest in providing a livable internship stipend wage, secure housing and transportation for some of these students to be able to take advantage and, you know, to be able to afford to spend a summer in those spaces, that would go so far. And another topic, and this may get very kind of chicken and egg, I spend some time in this wheelhouse talking about the need, finding, right, somebody from a community to cover that community, who knows that community, who can cover what, right? But also recognizing, for example, that while it is valuable to have an Indigenous journalist in your newsroom who can bring some context and who maybe can work diligently to create those relationships, recognizing that that student who comes in as an intern or that recent graduate who comes in as a new hire has the same training as any journalist in your newsroom, and recognizing they can do the job of any journalist in that newsroom instead of just seeing them as only able or only going to do this because they say, oh, well, we can't afford to just have a journalist who's only covering Indigenous issues. Well, this journalist is trained to do all of these things, and give them a chance at that as well, I think would also go far. And the last anecdotal thing I'll say is that this is also recognizing that these students who are coming from different backgrounds and looking for opportunities are looking for those same opportunities as other journalism students. I had a couple of my Indigenous students attend a career event with me. I had the opportunity to go around with some of my KU students. I had an opportunity to go around with some of my Indigenous students. And almost without fail, when my Indigenous students would approach those in the hiring position, that person would start talking to them, asking them, oh, well, do you know the native history of Wichita? Did you know that in Wichita we have this museum? And they didn't do that to my KU kids. They just immediately started talking to them about internships and how they hire. That was really eye-opening for me in that moment. And at the time, my Indigenous students didn't even realize what was happening, but that was a problem. And I kept saying, I think they'd really like to just get some information about your internships if you have that and how much you pay. And I had to keep bringing that conversation back. That was a problem.
I do think that one of the things that has happened, One of the things that has happened at the start is, so we have a new managing editor. We have a new, and he's black. We have a new assistant managing editor, and she's black. We have a new editorial page editor, and she's black. And so the only other person on the leadership team who isn't black is the executive editor, but he hired all of these folks. So my point being is we are highly focused on bringing in journalists of color and finding them and letting them know that, you know, we want them, and we're not, we want to pay them. We pay our interns as well. So, that's a big focus for us, is bringing in journalists of color. The other thing that I just wanted to touch on a little bit is being in the room and a leader in the room. One of the things that I do push is that I don't believe in a black journalist or an indigenous journalist coming into the room to cover indigenous issues, or a black journalist coming in to cover black issues. That is just ridiculous to me. I started out talking about me being black my whole life. You know, I've been black my whole life, and I've been writing about white people for 40 years. You know what I mean? So if I can write about white people, why can't white people take the time to engage with the community, learn about what's going on in the community, and do a good job? And I'm here as a black journalist to look at that copy and to help educate them about how to best cover what you're using the wrong language. This is not, you can't say the new slavery. But my point being is we have to get to the point where journalists can cover the communities that their newspaper is in. You know, it's just not enough to excuse, you know, I'm white and I don't think I can go and cover that story in the black community. What? No, I just don't believe it. That's all I want to say.
I also wanted to add, you know, your newsroom environment or culture has to be one that's safe. I feel that, you know, gone are the days that people entering the workforce are willing to work for companies that create abusive environments for them, that don't value them. So, you know, my experience with the Lawrence Times has been that my perspective on issues across the board are valued, and that I have a seat at the table, and that my voice is being heard, and that I'm not being silenced. And although I don't want to be a token, and that I don't want to be the only person who can cover, you know, a black-owned business that's opening up, or a systemic racial issue that's going on, I know that if there's a story that I see within my community that needs to be told, I'm not going to be silenced, because my editor knows that I have that lived experience, and that I'm just completely valued across the board, and it's a safe environment. Nobody wants to work in an unsafe environment.
I agree. I think that was one of the things that I noticed early on in our newsroom, was that we had journalists come into the room who were afraid to speak up. So, yeah, you have to be in an environment where it is safe to speak up. And so you see something happening in your community, and you may not be able to cover that thing, but somebody needs to cover it. And that's why there have to be journalists in the room who know how to do that. That's all. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's really important to talk about, is understanding that we aren't tokens for that specific beat of coverage, but still letting allies and still letting editors really like learn and understand how to cover our communities respectfully. I had a lot of people asking me if they were allowed to come to this event because they were white. And I said this answer over and over again, but there is no wrong position to be, there's no wrong resume to have to be educated on something. And I think that's something that's super important to think about, is that just because you may not directly be connected to that minority community, and just because you may be white or you may feel like you don't really have a say in this, and a lot of times you might not have a say in that, but it's important to listen. You know, even if you're not the one covering it, it's important to listen. And I recently had a conversation with someone where, with a reporter, where he told me that there was, basically there was a conversation about this person's presence on their staff and understanding that, like there's two people competing for the same job or whatever, and the one person, the white guy, got offended that he essentially said that she brings a different level of experience and perspective because she is a person of color. And he said, I had gone to journalism school, like you don't understand, like I have the degree. And I think that is the farthest thing from the truth, because you can't get a degree in being brown. You have experiences that are lived, you can educate yourself, you can use resources, you can ask respectful questions, but at the end of the day, you can't relate to those experiences and truly, truly, truly understand what those people are going through. And so I don't think any amount of years of experience or a degree can take that away from journalists of color and people who do have these lived experiences with these things that they are covering. So, yeah, absolutely.
I think that's definitely a very important point that I would agree with for sure. I know our newsroom, our mission statement is to produce information for the survival and flourishing of Black people, of all Black people. And we actually just, at the beginning of this year, we did our strategic plan, which is basically like a 40-page, super long, boring document, pretty much. It's like 40 pages. But literally, in the strategic plan, out of all those 40 pages, we don't say the word journalism one time. And we specifically emphasize, again, producing information for the survival and flourishing of Black people. And I think, to your point, to me at least, and to our newsroom, it doesn't require having a journalism degree. And that's part of making our newsroom more inclusive and more diverse, because as soon as you require people to actually have a journalism degree, that the amount of Black people, for instance, who can even get a journalism degree is already a very small amount. And so we're already restricting the potential inclusivity of our newsroom if we require people to have a journalism degree to even be a part of our newsroom. And I think, again, as you were saying, for instance, there's a lot of people who are incarcerated, who are excellent, phenomenal writers, much better than people who have been trained journalists. There are people who are houseless, who have very important stories to tell that they should be able to tell themselves, that don't need to go to journalism school to be able to tell their stories. And so I think, again, kind of expanding our view of how media should operate and like what we even view as important and necessary to be able to tell people's stories, I think that is rethinking that is very important to how we can make our newsrooms more inclusive also.
Yeah, I think that's something that I definitely feel like needs to be talked about a lot more, because we've had one or two conversations recently that had to do with someone saying, you know, like, I have the degree in this, and why does that matter? But you guys heard my thoughts on that. Is there any other impactful or memorable stories that you guys have covered that you felt like they shed light on issues facing communities of color were facing, before I move on to the resources?
Something that came to mind, you know, what really brought me into the journalism field were resistance movements. I was empowered and inspired by people standing up for human rights. But I also came to learn that another part that, you know, is missing a lot is, you know, for example, if we're covering Black issues, a lot has to do with, you know, loss and pain and hurt and racism. And there's another side that I think we really need more of, and that's joy and art and creation and community that we create. I think so much, the narrative of marginalized groups of people is that we've achieved something in spite of something else, when that's true. We are a people of resistance, but we have been creating since our inception, and we don't need someone else to tell us that we're amazing to know that we're amazing. So I think that's something that journalists of color, we can really bring that aspect of joy. And one story I was really excited to be able to do that with was the history of Black writing at KU. I didn't even know the program was there until last year. I connected with the director, Dr. Mary Emma Graham, and then I met she's the founding director, and then I met the director, Dr. Aisha Hodison. Found out that they were celebrating their 40th year anniversary this year, last fall, and was able to do a feature on them. And I was really excited because I felt like they weren't really receiving, their flowers. I hadn't even heard about it. Once I was doing my interviews and my research, I found out, this is a story about Black women. Because the founder, of course, is a Black woman. The director and most of the graduate students involved with Black women. And the organization was founded upon Black women resistance movements, Black women writers of the 1930s and 40s. And so I discovered this as I was writing, and I think, maybe I give myself a little credit for paying attention to the interviews, but I also think my perspective as a Black woman really allowed me to pull that out of the story and take it in a different direction that gave Black women their flowers, which I don't think is done nearly enough. And I guess that kind of just goes to my point about bringing stories of joy and art and creation. I think that's what we can do as journalists of color.
The most fun that I've had as a journalist was when I became an editorial writer, a columnist, because that's when I really had an opportunity to tap into my lived experience and write from my gut and my heart and my head about Black America, my people I met along the way, and I could really bring my lived experiences to that. So just column after column after column, I was able to do that. It was cathartic. It was amazing to be able to do that. And even as I became a manager, one of the things that I negotiated was I have to still be able to write a column. So in other words, journalists being able to use your voice, to truly use your learned experience and put that out there is one way that we can elevate, highlight, delight, and entertain and talk about Black America or indigenous Americans or whatever the case may be, Black and brown people and those who've historically been marginalized, in a way that celebrates that, and that's how I've done it.
So many stories, so little time. I'm telling y'all, I was just telling Melissa, I'm like, oh my God, we could be here all night. But most of my time has been spent working as a foreign editor. So that, and I could go through, Fall of Berlin Wall and all these other stories that some students are like, huh? They look at me like, huh? Or, when Nelson Mandela was freed and he came to the States. I was on maternity leave with my son, but, just to know that so many years later, he led the government, and the election is in a couple weeks. There's a new election, and the ANC is expected to lose. So I say that to say that there are so many stories that have happened over my career and I've had a hand in. Probably most notably is violence against women, in which we looked at the universality of violence against women, and we not only looked at it from abroad, but we brought it all the way home. And at that time, women were being raped by police in Dallas. So we wanted to make sure that it was not just a foreign phenomenon. It was something that was very prevalent here in this country and even in our own backyard. So that, of course, is up at the top, but all the other stories in between, making sure that when my reporters in Africa, whether they were in Kenya or Ethiopia or wherever Carl Vick was roaming around, he was one of them, that we were writing about what was happening on the ground with people. All the things that Carl wrote about, he'd tell me, okay, Pat, I'm gonna go ahead and I'll do the main stories. I might just feed the meter, but then he would go and do art and culture, sports, all the other things that we don't think about. We think about it's only in this country. No, there's other places. And that they're doing the same things we are. And then, of course, when you travel, you see those things. It's no different, it's just a different group of people. And so that is some of the stuff that for me has been most, most inspiring. And I even still see my friends at the Post still doing some of those things, trying as they might. So, there's just so many things. Oh, she's drinking my water. She's drinking her water.
Yeah, so earlier this year I wrote a story it was a opinion piece that was called I'm Middle Eastern but I'm white on paper. And that had been something that I felt very close to my whole life because I was like 7, like throwing a fit in the doctor's office being like, there's no brown option, there's no Middle Eastern option on this form. In which I would always just refuse to answer or put other, and my parents would get mad at me and be like, just answer the dang thing. But I had almost like suppressed that frustration of mine for a really long time until first semester I was freaking out. I was like, how am I going to pay for college? How am I going to do any of this? And my counselors had told me, oh my gosh, like, you should apply for this scholarship. You're a great candidate for it. I know the people, they have the whole headquarters in Seattle. They're known for helping students of color at college. I filled out the form. I got to the last page, and it even asked me to answer what country are you from? And then it told me that it didn't believe that I was a person of color, and it told me that it doesn't count as what they consider POC, and essentially that I'm white. And so it's been a running joke in my journalism staff, people being like, oh, like Natasha's white, because obviously I'm not. I don't need to explain why I'm not, but definitely not. And so I wrote that editorial because in that moment I felt so alone. I was so frustrated. I was like, this is my way of paying for college, and now I'm not just a 7-year-old getting upset in a doctor's office at the form. I am literally trying to find my financial aid for college, and I can't seem to do that because they don't count me as a person of color. And so I went on this deep dive over why that was and why the US Census hadn't changed to including MENA, Middle Eastern, North African people, as people of color. And so I basically just went down like a rabbit hole about how the US Census form was sitting on President Trump's desk when he decided to move out of the way and say we're prioritizing other things. And I wrote that opinion piece. Arabella designed the graphic for it. And I posted it, and I got so much support and so many people from my social medias, like from California, Middle Eastern people being like, thank you for talking about this. And I was nervous to write it because it was something that I hadn't ever seen anyone else talk about. I felt like I was complaining about something. I felt like I was like, no one wants to hear me talk about this. I'm just talking about me on a paper. And then when it came down to my financial aid and me freaking out about college, I was like, oh my God, this is much bigger than I thought it was. So now I actually will be officially counted as a person of color in 2030. Yeah, 6 years to go. But for now, that scholarship people, my counselor emailed them and even went off on them about how they can't be advocating to support people of color, and even having like some Middle Eastern people on the front page of their website, and then having the rest of us say like, no, you're white. So that was something that I was super baffled thinking about. The next question I want to ask you guys is, what are some resources for journalists of color wanting to have an impact on underrepresented communities? And with that, what advice would you give them?
There's the National Association of Black Journalists, of course. The National Association of Black Journalists, which they do have high school chapters and college chapters, and I would say that for Black journalists, that's probably the #1 resource that I would, if I were a high school student today or a college student today, I would definitely engage there for sure. Because, I mean, there's so much to learn from them. There's a money contest, scholarship, all kinds of resources for you as a journalist in that organization.
I would add Dow Jones, my former colleague, but she's a friend, Shirley Carswell, runs that program now. I was a Dow Jones intern, not only urban journalism workshop in high school, but also a graduate intern. And so they have tons of money, and I know that Shirley is working to increase that money and to make sure it's really getting out to all students, but she also is focusing in on students of color. And then the other thing is, if we're just looking, are we just looking for money, or are we looking for
Mentorships, all of it.
So here's the thing about mentorships. When I was a student here, again, many years ago, I had two mentors. One was Professor Samuel Adams, and he was the only Black professor there at the school. I never had him for class. I came in on the urban journalism workshop as a high schooler. I never had him in for class. And then my other mentor was Dean Suzanne Shaw, and I never had her for class. And I'm saying this because sometimes it's not going to necessarily be those people that you're in class with. It's going to be somebody else out there. They always told me the truth. They did not sugarcoat anything. Sometimes, I'd be like, whoa, did they really just say that to me? But they were honest with me. They cared for me. And so then when you can have a over 40-year relationship with them. Now, Professor Adams has died about a year after I got here in 2019, but Dean Shaw is still 10 minutes away and still ruling the roost and, still got that finger. But I say that to say, when you find a mentor, keep them. They are worth their weight in gold. And they can really help you. Again, you don't want somebody who's just going to sugarcoat all your bad ideas. And I have some that I'm mentoring still. I have a couple of them, they're in the industry, they're doing very well, but they will call and I'll say, well, really, should we do that? Should you do that? It really does come down to them, but we usually can have an honest conversation. So you want a mentor who's going to be honest with you and about your bad behavior, about your bad this, that, and the other, but also be willing to applaud you when you do those great things.
I agree with both of those. If you can find a mentor that goes so far, I did a lot of self-navigating, and I guess I did okay.
Yeah.
Doesn't always mean it was the easiest road. But one thing I would love to say, these professional associations that we have talked about are important, are so helpful, do have so many resources and scholarships. They also have membership fees. And a lot of students either don't have the funding for that or don't see that as a priority, right, to pay for that membership. if we could find ways for those associations to not have student membership fees, if we could find ways to make it easier for students to attend those conferences. Because going to a conference, you have to be a member of the organization, so you've already paid a membership fee. You have to pay to register to go to the conference. And then sometimes there's add-ons if you want to go to the special dinner, which of course you do. Who wants to go and then not go to the special dinner? Then you have to have a hotel and travel, etc. It can get pretty cost prohibitive to take advantage of some of these opportunities. So I would say, let's ask our schools at all levels to support their students who want to be part of these organizations. Let's ask these organizations to make it a little easier for students to take advantage of those. I was on a task force for, and I won't name the association, but it was a large journalism association, and they were trying to figure out their chapters are declining, student chapters. They didn't have any representation at any of the tribal colleges across our country, very little representation at HBCUs and other minority serving institutions, and they were just utterly confused about this. But the rules to start a chapter were so complicated and insurmountable. I was like, you all are never going to get a chapter at any of these schools. I was like, you need to change the rules. So some of that, there are a ton of resources out there. We need to make them more accessible and just rethink how we're possibly creating some of our own obstacles to access.
That would be a great campaign for students to take up, is to, campaign against these organizations that charge these incredible registration fees and, that basically don't allow students to, I can't even afford it, so I know, I know what I'm talking about. It's really
Amongst academics,
Yeah.
we are thinking, the conference thing is it's a bit of a game.
Yeah, it is. It's just really super expensive, but it would be a great student journalism campaign to get them to change the rules.
Not at all.
Yeah, I think two other things. The first one is just kind of professional advice, basically, which I think is, in addition to those professional associations, I think just making something that was very helpful for me when I was in school was just making a list of literally 10 people who I don't know yet, who I look up to, basically, who they can be any level of fame, basically. And oftentimes, if you are just a high schooler or even a college student, willing to take the initiative to reach out to someone like that and ask literally just for 15 minutes of their time, usually that's just a way to get them in, and then you can maybe have a 30-minute meeting or something. But just having a list and following up, and usually those people will respond. If you meet with one of them, asking at the end of the conversation if they have 2 or 3 other recommendations of people who they think you should reach out to, who they might be willing to connect you with, I think that is a very good strategy. And then in terms of mentorship, for me personally, a lot of my mentors have, again, just been through books, basically, and me going back to, for me as a journalist or a reporter, media person, one of the things that has been most liberatory for me is reading the actual physical Black Panther newspapers, for instance, and understanding what their values were, what they were talking about, what they were thinking about, how they wrote, their style, all of those things. Reading Frederick Douglass, reading Ida B. Wells. Recently, I discovered a writer named Claudia Jones, who was also an amazing she liked to use the word journalist. And so, yeah, I think just reading these books on the history of journalism, especially journalists of color, I think that can serve as a sort of guide or mentorship as well.
What Ryan, you were saying, I call that building your personal board of directors. That everybody should have their own personal board of directors. people that you have reached out to over the years, and you build this strong network of folks who you can go to for a variety of different things who are going to be honest and truthful. And that's what I call building your board of directors. I call both of my sons, check with your board of directors, say, ask me questions about things. One's an engineer. I don't know anything about engineering. He's asking me, I'm like, is there somebody on your board of directors who can answer that for you? Go to them. So I say, build your own personal board of directors.
So I want to dedicate the rest of the time to anyone that has any questions. Any of you have any questions for anyone else? Just raise your hand or shout them out and let me know. So.
I have a question. Okay, I'm honestly asking all of you to share your thoughts on this because, you know, we talk about journalistic practice and journalism with a capital J and objectivity, right? We were all trained, we're supposed to be objective. What does it mean to be objective? Well, it means I'm sometimes going to cover things, people I don't agree with, but it's my job to let them share their perspective. The rest of my job is to make sure all perspectives are included and represented. But I have someone who I would put on my board of directors. And when I talk about the purpose of Native media, as a media historian, I talk about it starting as a vehicle to inform, educate, and advocate, because we're going back to the Cherokee Phoenix, who was absolutely started to push back against forcible removal. So it was absolutely advocating a perspective when it was founded. It was founded to do that. But then as journalism professionalized, objectivity became the standard by which all things are measured. So this person who would be on my board of directors, when I say advocacy, he always sort of, and he is like the granddaddy of Native media, so, you know, I take him seriously. He's like, I don't really like that word advocacy. So his take is objectivity isn't the goal, the highest value, fairness is. Stopping short of a call to action, and that is journalism.
Well, certainly it has to be today. Well, it certainly has to be that today because of the danger of and the attacks on our democracy. Because journalism doesn't exist without democracy, right? So we have to protect that. So to some degree, you know, I mean, there is a sense of advocacy in that protection of democracy. Truth and fairness is my weapon. And that is my weapon towards advocacy. Truth and fairness, honesty. Yes, I give the other guy a space to say what he has to say, so I include him too. But if I know that person is not telling the truth, I have also the obligation to point that out as well. So, I mean, and that I think has changed over the years, where you see more of that, like when we're vetting something, or we're truth checking, or those kinds of things that we do. There were years we didn't do that before, and so that you see more of that. Objectivity, truth, there is no such thing as true, and true objectivity, really, because you bring, as we started with this, you bring your lived experiences to everything you do. You just have to be honest, true, fair, and balanced in your coverage, in your work, and professional, but there's still a tone, there's still a word choice. There's so much about who you are that you cannot separate from what you do. So the only thing you can rely on are your tools: truth, justice, honesty, fairness.
Yeah, and I want to add something to that, because I feel like balance and fairness is really important in journalism, but it's no lie that a lot of us, like student journalists, are there because we care very deeply about something. And so I think it's unfair to use that passion and emotion to bring us to the space to then lock it back in the closet. You know what I'm saying? Like, I feel like it's something that people don't talk about enough, is being able to be objective when you need to be, being able to be fair and balanced, but also understanding that your emotions are your power and that fuels you, and that's something that you shouldn't apologize for caring about something. So
I don't think that's ever been an issue, at least in the places I've been. I mean, you know, we all have cared about things. I mean, especially with violence against women. We worked on that for 2 years.
That's why you chose that subject.
And that's why we chose that subject, and that's why, and yes, was it advocacy? Yeah, it was. Because nothing had been written with the power, with the forcefulness that we did. And to be able to had to have the breadth and depth of that project. So, you know, there's been all this stuff about objectivity, whether or not you should be able to, you know, protest if you want to, you know. I mean, you know, in our newsroom, in the Post newsroom, you know, my boss, Leonard Downey Jr., and one of my very good friends, Dan Balt, they didn't vote. But you know what? I walked every time there was an election and had my little sticker on. I voted. That was their choice. They felt that they had to show this sense of being objective and being fair. But I mean, really, like you said, there is no such thing.
You can't.
And so that's what they would do. They would, you know, but they didn't force the rest of us to do it. Now, you know, I didn't get to go to protests and things until after I left the paper and was out here and have been to a couple things. I've been out. It's a weird circumstance. It's a very weird thing for me to go. I'm not out there screaming and hollering, but it's a weird thing for me to go because that was the way I was taught not to do. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't send money and do this and do that. But now it's a different thing. So I'm learning a whole new way. And it's a good thing. It's really a good thing. I've always had those thoughts and those feelings, but sometimes when you're working for companies and doing that, you have to be careful. At that point, it was much more of a thing. One of my colleagues, if you've never read his stuff, Wesley Lowery, Wesley, you know, he kind of got into some trouble about that whole thing about objectivity. And he walked from the Post after he won a Pulitzer on his on that project on police shootings. But if you're looking for somebody to read his stuff, he still is writing about that. He's teaching at the New School now in New York, but he's writing about objectivity. He's even had a conversation with Lynn Downey Jr., who's now at Arizona State. He's having those conversations. He's had a conversation with our former boss, Martin Barron. So things are changing a little bit. We're having those conversations out loud. They never used to have them. But again, this is where the next generation is forcing the old ones to kind of do some things differently. And that's okay. It really is really okay.
What was his name?
Oh, Wesley Lowery, Lowery, Wesley. He's got some fabulous stuff. He's constantly writing about this, but now he's teaching. He's even taught one of my classes when I first got here. He got in on the Zoom and they loved him because he's young. He covered Mike Brown back there in the day he was arrested. He has a whole different kind of feel about this stuff than say I do or maybe any of us do. And that's good because he's teaching us, well, maybe we need to think a little bit differently about that. And I think if you ask some young people in the newsroom, and I'm thinking about one of my mentees, Karen Attia, who writes a column for the Post, it's different now. And now she's teaching part-time at Columbia. I haven't chatted with her yet, but I just want to get all of her feelings about this, what's happening with the students there. Are you being, what about objectivity? We have those little tips, we chat about it. But again, we can have those conversations and those hard conversations, and that's okay. She's the one who turned me on to Black Twitter when it was Twitter, y'all. Hey?
Something I'm thinking of, you know, as I'm still learning, I'm in my early kind of years with, you know, being in the field. A lot of the stories that we cover and some of my favorite articles to do are ones that are focused on, like, you know, initiatives that the community members are doing or projects. For example, I recently did a fun one about a queer library that the Raven Bookstore is creating. And it was kind of in response to the recent bill that our governor vetoed around gender non-conforming care. And with stories like that, which I do all the time, I kind of struggle with the idea of objectivity. It's like I'm not intentionally seeking out some other side, because to me the purpose of the article is to amplify something, to amplify people, to tell a story, to send some sort of message, and it's something, you know, positive. So I kind of am still like in a weird kind of understanding about when objectivity or transformational journalism is in play. I mean, is it every story we do? Is it just the deeper systemic issues? Because there's some stories, quite honestly, that, you know, I'm not seeking out hateful rhetoric, you know, because if I were to do that, and maybe using that example of the queer library story, I'm in no position to uplift any kind of messaging that tells trans people that their existence is wrong.
Well, I would not say that you would seek out hateful in a situation like that. Now, if you were writing a story about that and there were protesters outside that didn't want that queer library to exist, then you need to go and get comment from them, right? You can't ignore them and just do the story that is uplifting with these people standing outside in protest. You have an obligation then to go and find out why are they there and what do they have to say. But when you're writing a story like that without that kind of conflict or fault line involved, then yes, you can do that. But I also think that you might take it a step and say, you know, why is this library important? I mean, you write the story about the library and about the library opening, but give a space for somebody to talk about why it's important to the community. In other words, they will say, because, you know, we've been under attack, we need to have this. And so then you're bringing that other side into it in a way that still is uplifting. So there's always ways to make sure that you're covering the whole story as opposed to narrow.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah, I can just give a quick example. I know for us at least, we are like a very openly pro-Black outlet, and like we if you go to our about page, like we don't say we're objective whatsoever. We don't even, like, we also don't believe in objectivity. And just for an example, like I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with Ralph Yarrow. He was the 16-year-old who was shot for ringing the wrong doorbell last year.
Yeah.
And we were one of the first outlets to help break that story. So we broke the story essentially, or at least we broke all of the most important components of the story. And then we actually also organized the protest after we broke the story. And like we have no problem with doing that. And again, we go back to, we look at like what are some of the most circulated Black newspapers in American history. One of them was the Black Panther newspaper, which doesn't get talked about very frequently in the history of the Black press. Of course, the Black Panthers were not objective in any way, shape, or form. And one of the other largest Black newspapers was Muhammad Speaks, which is Malcolm X's newspaper. I think we also know Malcolm X was not objective in any way, shape, or form. And so for us, which I would also, in terms of scholarship, backing up how to still be accurate, truthful, and have integrity in your reporting methodologies, Dr. Anita Barma from UT Austin helped create scholarship around the type of reporting called solidarity reporting, which again is very focused on uplifting, like you were saying, marginalized perspectives, because again, for us, we don't really have, if there were if there's a Black Lives Matter rally and there's like some right-wing people who come to the Black Lives Matter rally, our news outlet at least, is probably not going to interview the right-wing people because we view that as the hegemonic view that already has many platforms, and we don't feel it's necessary for us to platform that voice that we feel is violent to our community. And so I definitely understand all of the sides of journalism, but just to offer the perspective that we come from in our newsroom, I would say that those are just some of the views that we had.
And I really think, I look at journalism today, it's almost like a quilt. Like that there are various ways of doing journalism. And we need them all in order to get to express what is truth and fair and honest. We need, what Ryan does, I have so much respect for him. He does journalism differently than I do. But I don't ever miss reading what he's doing because what he's doing is important. So mainstream media we do it differently. But I've learned so much from him, and I'm sure he's learned some from mainstream news as well. So it's like this quilt that covers the community, and it takes broadcast, radio, advocacy journalism, all of that in order to do it.
Which is also why it's so important to be reading a broad array of sourcing, right?
Absolutely.
Exposing ourselves to different perspectives, ideas, and presentations of information is valuable.
I don't need it to have a big mouth.
Yeah, so are there any other questions? Yes.
I do have one. Sorry, I spent too much time behind the camera. I was just curious, and I'm kind of coming at this, I'm a lot younger, and so going through a pandemic where there was a lot of very powerful people making a lot of very incorrect statements. We had an election, a lot of very powerful people making a lot of incorrect statements, and you brought up the very disturbing degradation of our democracy, and I'm just curious, how do you ensure that in this time that the truth is still told? And when people are getting their information from, so many different spaces, how do you ensure that that truth still reaches people?
I mean, that was one of the things that I enjoyed about being an editorial writer and a columnist, because I could really just tell it like it is, and I could say it as long as I could back everything up with facts. And I would say, and when I knew that someone was spewing falsehoods, and misinformation, nothing ticked me off more than that, and I would hone in on that person and say this, and just one sentence, this is false, and here's why, and here's where this comes from, and here's why I disagree with this, and here's why you should disagree with this, and I could say that. And I think that columnists and editorial writers have a responsibility to do that, to call it out every time, back it up, and be loud about it. I mean, there's a lot of noise in the room. And so I'm either going to quiet the noise. I want to be the loudest person in the room. So, yeah, I think that's one way that we do that.
So I would just say, I used to sit next to the fact checker, Glenn Kessler. I used to sit next to Glenn every day. There was something that they were cackling about, and if you don't know who the fact checker is, you should check him out on the Post website. His name is Glenn Kessler. And what he does and his team, they go in and say President Biden said X. They will go in and look at it and say, well, wait a minute, maybe did he really say X? Or he meant, what he said wasn't correct. And he said Trump had, 30,000 some odd lies over the period of, when he was president. Yeah, I think it was 30,000. But every stone is unturned. Every stone is turned over. And so it doesn't matter if it's President Biden, it could be any of us, et cetera, et cetera. So what I'm trying to teach my students to do is, when you are writing, make sure that you put in where you're getting this information from. If I teach a State House reporting class, and I was reading a story before I came here, an enterprise piece. They're just about finished up. And all throughout. So make sure you're putting hyperlinks in. I want to go back and check out what Senate Bill 333 says. I want to be able to go in and look at the information for myself. When are you talking to people? When are you talking to sources? Tell me when that interview was. Where did you get that quote from? I had one student this week, y'all, and she's one of my better ones, and I don't know, I know we get to the end and she's about to graduate, so I'll give her that. But she just put in some quote, and I said, oh, did you talk to that person from the Pennsylvania Secretary of State's office? No, she had not. And what she had done is she had taken it, you know, and it was from a conference in December. So we put that information in. The more information to help the reader along, the better it is. And you know, let's face it, sometimes some people are just not going to believe a thing anybody says. You know, it doesn't matter if you have all the facts right there, if you've already rebutted whatever. Some people are just not going to. But I think that if, you know, at least in my small sphere now, I'm teaching them, you've got to be able to put all the information out there. Otherwise, people just have no idea about how to go about and get that information. But, you know, we've got to be better. We have to be better with this. And there have been people in the profession who have, for the years, did not do that. And so you would have more stories that would be written as analysis. You're not seeing as many analysis written anymore. We always used to have, and these are people who are really experts in whatever field, whatever, you know, we'd have some folks on the foreign desk who were experts in whatever they were doing. In fact, one of them won a Pulitzer yesterday. His name is David Hoffman. When I went to the Post in '97, he was the Moscow bureau chief. He's a freaking expert. He knows Russia like the back of his hand. But nowadays, you don't see as many analysis pieces because, again, people are wondering, most of that is left for the editorial page, which is where he is now. Mm-hmm. So it's a little bit different now, but the more we can help the reader to understand and to be able to see it for themselves, and then they can go and look, because people do use those hyperlinks, y'all. I don't know if they do use them, because then I can go in and go check it for myself, which is what I do when I'm editing behind my students. So, yeah, this whole thing about democracy, the Post added a desk that really is looking at that whole issue. I mean, it really is a little frightening considering, you know, the Berlin Wall fell and we were thinking about everything behind the curtain was bad, and here we are, have it right here in our own backyard.
We've taken also to doing, just to piggyback a little bit on what Patricia was saying, is we've taken to doing how I did that story. So we do an in-depth piece, and then we'll have the reporters and the writers to write a secondary piece on how they did the story. So they talk about how many stacks, how many boxes of documents they went through, how long it took them to go through those documents, where they got the documents from, who they talked to, how many people they interviewed, and all of that is just to explain to the reader how I did the story. And those have been very well read. People like to see how you did that, so they're not thinking that somebody just told you something and suddenly you wrote it. That there was 6 months of research and study and in-depth reporting that went into a piece before you actually put it out there. That helps.
And real quick, I wanted to add, you know, as much as possible, free and accessible access to news. I know everybody's got to eat, but there's, you know, ways to kind of go around it. I've actually been interested in doing some research on, you know, ways publications can go without a paywall. I know it's really, really difficult, but I think that's huge when we're talking about journalism being the cornerstone of democracy, and also utilizing social media to the best of our ability. You know, if we can post infographics or share resources via Instagram and Facebook, or repost articles for free there, that's huge.
Wrapping up, I just want to thank you all for coming here today and joining us. I want to thank you all for coming here today and sharing your thoughts and experiences. I'm 18. A lot of the people here watching online are going to be like teenagers too, so it really does mean the world to me to hear your perspective, because that is that's the way I always learned best, was listening to people like you all and my role models speak. So thank you all so much. Thank you to the Art Love Collective for allowing us to use this beautiful space. And thank you to my staffers for listening to me complain about issues and encouraging me to write about them. So, yeah, thank you guys.
Thank you.